So in 2020, we chose the topic of the global food crisis. And of course, like so many other events, for like our symposium, we had to cancel because of the global pandemic. But now in 2022, it seems that there's no better time to bring awareness to the issue of food. COVID-19 and now the Russian invasion of Ukraine have pushed an already strained system to new levels. People are hungrier, food is more expensive, putting a meal on the table is a little bit harder. In fact, just this morning, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics released its annual report, or its latest report. Inflation hit a 40-year high of 8.5%. And when it comes to food at home, the index rose 10% over the last year. That's the largest 12-month increase. All right, so these numbers that I was mentioning just before we had all these issues are quite troubling, but at the same time, we've seen an incredible push for action and for solutions around the world, in the United States, and even right here in our own backyard of Tarrant County. With us today is Julie Butner, President and CEO of the Tarrant Area Food Bank. Julie is a TCU alumna. She spent most of her career working in healthcare and hospital industries. She also served as a captain in the United States Army during Operation Desert Storm. Julie now leads a new group of troops here, feeding our local community. We also have Paul Skoczylas, the Deputy Director of the World Food Programme's UN System and Multilateral Engagement Division in New York. Paul has dedicated his professional life to service and helping those in most need. To name just a few ways in which he's done that, he spent more than 7 years leading humanitarian and development projects in Lebanon, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. Before that, he helped shape U.S. policy during the economic, energy, and food crisis as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of State in Washington. Megan Thompson and Melanie Saltzman join us today from PBS NewsHour Weekend. Together as grantees of the Pulitzer Center, they reported and produced a really fascinating series called The Future of Food. We'll talk a lot about that today and their reporting. Megan is an Emmy-nominated and a Gracie and National Headliner Award winner. She's covered a number of issues for PBS shows and series. Melanie is a Fulbright Scholar and now reporter for PBS NewsHour Weekend. She's covered issues on mental health, the environment, and the opioid epidemic. She's also traveled to Africa to focus on solutions-based reporting. Thank you all so much for being here today. So let's start our conversation with the situation now. The UN World Food Programme recently warned that the world was facing a year of catastrophic hunger in 2022, with 811 million people going to bed hungry every night because of famine, conflict, and natural disasters. We have emergencies in Ukraine, Afghanistan, Yemen, and several African countries. Here in the US, more than 54 million people are expected to face food insecurity. Paul, can you talk to us a little bit about how COVID and the situation in Ukraine have made what seems like a bad situation worse?
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So let's just talk about before February 24th, before the current war in Ukraine, because that really sets the stage for a catastrophe on top of a disaster. I was having a team meeting in the new year, planning 2022, and we were thinking, we have a new crisis in Afghanistan. That was a crisis that was ongoing, but it really became a lot bigger during the pullout because of the financial crisis there and all the factors going on there. And we were worried about Afghanistan overshadowing the other crises: Yemen, the Sahel, Madagascar, DRC, Myanmar, Somalia, Horn of Africa. There were so many crises, and Afghanistan was an urgent crisis and needed urgent funding, but no less so than the other crises. And then came, and what was going on then, it was the triple C crisis. It was the economic impacts of COVID and the closures. It was climate change, and really the big one is conflicts. Conflicts are raging around the world, and they are causing hunger and displacement. So we had the triple C crisis, and we were facing really a record number of people to reach in 2022. And then on top of all that came this new war in Ukraine. And that's just been devastating because first of all, let's just not forget what's happened there. 40,000 people have died, according to Reuters. 11 million people have been displaced. About half of those have left the country. And that just leaves, just try to imagine yourself in that situation. You're leaving your home, you're leaving your livelihood. Everything you have is gone. You're just carrying what you have, the shirt on your back. And so that's a devastation. But there's a bigger one, is that Ukraine and the Black Sea region and Russia are also food producers and fertilizer producers. So what we're looking at is there's a greater number of people in need now because of Afghanistan, because of Ukraine. But we're also looking at downstream impacts of the fertilizer and also the breadbasket being cut off.
Thank you, Paul. Julie, you and the team at the Tarrant Area Food Bank are no doubt some of the fiercest frontline workers that we've seen. What happened when COVID hit? How did you have to change the way you approach feeding our local community here, and what are you seeing today?
So in our community, we have about 2.9 million people that live in the 13 counties that we serve, and of the 2.9 million, about 540,000 are food insecure. So that's a lot of people to feed just right here locally. We saw an 80% increase in the number of people who needed food in our community, largely due to layoffs. And I know all of you saw that on TV and in the news and in the media. Just a lot of people who instantly lost their job, did not have the wherewithal or the resources in savings or what have you to cover very basic needs such as food and gasoline, utilities, and rent. We too are seeing impacts due to the economy. You know, today Fort Worth and Tarrant County is the 12th largest community in the United States, and we are the fastest growing community in the United States. So when you have that kind of population growth, you have strains on infrastructure, including housing, supply and demand. If you don't have enough housing, guess what happens with the prices? I don't have to tell all of you that. So we're faced with a real urgent matter that goes well beyond COVID as we're trying to recover from COVID and the economy is trying to recover. We now have inflation at 8.5%. Food cost is going up. Gasoline costs are going up. And in this state, minimum wage is $7.25. Now, unless you're living with somebody else or you're working a second or a third job, $7.25 is not going to cover those basic necessities, rent, utilities, gas, and food. So the lines at the food bank are longer, and we foresee that will continue.
And we saw people, too, that maybe had never faced food insecurity before suddenly put in that position.
A lot of folks who had never, but you know, food insecurity is an interesting thing because sometimes it's very short-lived, but life is crisis. You look at Ukraine, nobody in Ukraine would have told you 2 months ago that they would be displaced and looking for food and looking for housing, and that's how quickly it happens. Same thing happened with COVID here. Just a quick pause.
Thanks, Julie. Melanie, you did some reporting on food insecurity and during COVID when it first started and how it impacted people here. Can you talk to us a little bit about that reporting that you did and what you learned from it?
We had done our series primarily before COVID, and then during COVID I reached back out to some of the farmers that we had worked with and reported on before. And you know, food, to me, it really is connected to everything. It's connected to culture and religion and politics, and there's this whole system that you don't think of being interconnected until something like this happens. Mm-hmm. There were meat plant closures that there's only a handful around the country that if something happens to one or two or three of them, there were these fears that there would be, you know, a lack of meat for people to be able to consume all around the country. And while those plants were closing, the farmers that I was working with and reporting on, they're producing the feed for that hog. So if there's no hogs being slaughtered and there's less demand for hogs, there's less demand for that feed. And those farmers are really struggling to be able to even keep their farms open. And these are farmers that were generational, you know, going back 3, 4, or 5 generations, fearful that their farms would just close indefinitely because of the pandemic. And then on the flip side, there were opportunities emerging for small scale regional meat producers that really struggled to compete against big guys, but saw opportunities during COVID because the big guys were not nimble, they couldn't adjust. These small scale producers actually started to find a lot of business during COVID that didn't exist for them prior to it. So throughout our reporting, Megan and I tried to not only focus on the problems, but also solutions and innovations and opportunities that were emerging both before COVID and during it.
So some experts have called like the next big pandemic. None of us had ever lived through an actual global pandemic before until COVID, but some experts are calling the next pandemic world hunger. What's your response to that? I'll start with Megan. Megan, do you have a response to that? And that, are we seeing that? Is that what we're headed? Where you found that in your reporting and producing for PBS?
I think that what we found, I don't know that I'm necessarily the best expert when it comes to hunger. I would defer to Julie and Paul on that. But I think that what we found kind of time and time again in our reporting was just this idea that the way that we are producing food and consuming it is not sustainable. The systems that we've set up, the way we farm, the way that we slaughter animals, purchase food, dine in restaurants, it's just not sustainable. And we're sort of heading towards a place where if the pandemic is world hunger, we're not set up to deal with it. So like Melanie said, what we did was we tried to focus on a bunch of different solutions-oriented stories, taking a look at people who are doing things all around the world that may be able to alleviate some of these problems.
Paul, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I first of all, I have to just say, I hope everyone goes online and checks out the Pulitzer Center's Future of Food. It is truly outstanding set of reporting. So I just commend you, and it stands up. It was newsy reporting, feature reporting, but if you watch it now, it's all on point, and it's really pointing to the sustainability issues, but also the solutions. What I would say is, I really think about what Julie said. I've worked on domestic hunger in the United States. I was advisor on those issues in the government. And, it's all about, traditionally in my lifetime, we've always looked at food access as the key issue. There's enough food in the world to feed everyone right now. Question marks if we can sustain it, as Megan was saying, in the future with a growing population and the carbon footprint and the other things to do with food. But we never had a problem with supply since like basically World War II or before that. And what I think is new here is access to food is critical. So how do you get access to food? Well, Julie's team is doing that in your community. They're providing access to food. If you can't afford it, you can go to the food bank and there is still something there you can get. And that's what WFP does worldwide, is we provide that access to food for people who are priced out. And there's a lot of things you can do on the solution side, where we know when you don't have food, it's dangerous for your health. It's dangerous particularly for mothers, young children, but it's uncomfortable and it's tragic for anyone who experiences hunger. But on the flip side, food is a value chain, and you can create agricultural value chains. You could create value chains. I've seen, like in Brazil, they have community kitchens where poorer people have jobs cooking. They provide one hot meal a day to the community, and that gives elderly people, disabled people, or poor people something that they can go to. And so it's creating jobs in those kitchens, and it's also they're drawing on local agricultural producers. So they're growing the food. Sometimes they're kitchen gardens. They're just little gardens, but they provide fresh food. In WFP, we do that in schools, where we provide kids learn how to do simple growing of food, and then that becomes their school snack, and that keeps them in school. It gives them nutrition, and it introduces them to fresh, sustainable ways of eating. So while there's a lot of challenges here, there's also big opportunities to rethink how we do food systems, and it all starts locally.
And Julie, some of those solutions that we've seen, the Tarrant Area Food Bank has a lot to do with that.
Yeah, I do think that there is enough food to feed everybody. It's how do you connect people to the food. You know, how do you provide the access? And there's a lot of waste. And so what, at Tarrant Area Food Bank, 65% of our food comes from the government, either the United States Department of Agriculture or the Texas Department of Agriculture, and that's surplus food that farmers, ranchers cannot export overseas, or maybe there's during COVID, because of COVID and the virus, we could not transport overseas, or they're overproducing, and that food would go to waste if it would not be distributed across the network of 200 food banks. And likewise with our retailers and manufacturers and producers of food. Right here we have almost 200 different organizations that donate to Tarrant Area Food Bank. HelloFresh, Tom Thumb, Kroger, Amazon Fresh. I mean, you name it, they're donating food to Tarrant Area Food Bank, and they value the ability to donate that food, because if they did not donate it to us, it would go into our landfills. Now imagine that from an environmental standpoint. They also receive a tax credit, a tax break for the donations that they make to Tarrant Area Food Bank. So it's really more about how do we connect the food and the access to that food to the people who can't afford to buy enough food and are going hungry. There's plenty of food. And in terms of sustainability, there are lots of new methods that are being created, new innovative ways. And Texas A&M, the campus that's coming to downtown Fort Worth, they're very big into vertical farms, which are inside. And so they're not impacted by environmental stressors. And it's very difficult to grow food here in Texas, and particularly in North Texas. And so there are folks out there, scientists and students like you, that are thinking of innovative ways to make food, and so that we will have even more of an abundance of food. So there's no reason for people to go hungry. How do we connect the food to those who are in need?
It's interesting you bring up making food, because that leads me into my next question for Megan and Melanie. Your series, Future of Food, focused on a lot of different topics, the environment, climate change, but it also focused on, there was a particular piece, several particular pieces that talked about technology and this idea of growing food in different ways. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what you found in your reporting, because it was quite fascinating.
Technology played a really big part in the series that we did. Megan and I together, well, first with Paul, and that's actually how we connected and how we met. In the Middle East, I did 2 stories focusing on WFP's work. I really learned through that reporting that WFP is not only just giving food to people that need it. I mean, they were doing things that we had to ask him, how does this relate to giving food to people, like digital skills trainings and things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as food aid, but in the piece, I think he even said you can give a man a fish or you can teach a man to fish, with the hope being, if they give them these skills, that they then could get jobs outside of the country, potentially. For refugees, it's really hard to work in certain sectors in that country. So the innovations that they were doing on the ground, I didn't think of at first as, quote, food aid. And then I realized it totally makes sense for WFP to be trying to implement these things on the ground. There was a hydroponics unit and a hydroponics program. We went to Jordan, which is extremely water scarce, and they were trying to figure out, well, how can we grow barley to feed animals with basically, it was 30 seconds a day of watering and no soil. And they were teaching people and empowering people to grow this food themselves. And they were creating jobs by bringing people into the program and training them. So again, they were creating jobs and they were empowering people to figure out how to grow this food themselves long term. And to me, all of that was really innovative, much more than just saying, right now you're in a crisis and you need some food. That seemed much more sustainable longer term. And a lot of that was technology. A lot of it was technology that was just emerging. Now they have an app called the Lily, where people receiving the aid could look up the cheapest prices for the food. So the money was going much, much further than it had originally, because they were empowered to say, oh, I can go to this store instead of that store and spend a lot less on a bag of rice or on milk, and the aid was going much further, and all of that was down to technology. Paul knows, once I left there, I was kind of astounded at the work WFP was doing.
Megan, can you talk, you tried some interesting types of food, some GMO salmon and cell-based meat. Can you tell us a little bit about how technology, what you found with tech and how they're growing food with those particular foods? And I really want to know what it tasted like after.
Yeah, so like Julie pointed out, a major challenge for the world is just figuring out how do we produce more food. And so what we did is, I think these were actually the two first stories that we did, right, Melanie? This kind of was where the idea for a whole series about food came from. We did a story about genetically modified salmon, and we did a story about cell-based meat, which is basically growing meat in a lab, no animals harmed, in theory. And so for the salmon story, it's super fascinating. It is the only animal in the world that's been approved by the FDA and the authorities in Canada that's genetically modified to be consumed by humans. And it all started in a little lab up in Canada. There was a scientist who, back I think it was like the 80s, he started thinking, it was sort of right when gene editing technology was becoming a thing, and he thought, I wonder if we could use this in aquaculture, so fish farming. And what it turns out, I had no idea that salmon grow a little bit and then they stop growing. They grow a little bit and they stop growing. So it takes a while for them to get to market size. And what he did was he took some genes from another animal, inserted it into a salmon, so it never stopped growing. And so what that means is that you can get a salmon to market much faster, which has a host of economic benefits. And that also means that it's much more economically viable to grow these salmon in land-based facilities. Right now, that's the only place they're allowed to be to be farmed. The government will not allow them to be farmed anywhere else. But the promoters of this technology say that this now means you can have fresh sources of protein in places, you can harvest these things in places you could never do it before. When we visited a few years ago, they were just operating out of Canada, but they now have a facility in Indiana and a large facility underway in Ohio, and they're starting to introduce this into the market. It's still very small. You're not going to walk into a grocery store and see a genetically modified salmon necessarily on the shelf. So that was one interesting technology that we learned about. The other one, like I mentioned, was cell-based meat. And so there are actually a bunch of startups out there working on this, where you take a little tiny cell from an animal and you can actually grow, proliferate these cells in basically a petri dish in a lab, and you can end up with meat. This is also very much in its infancy. It's not allowed to be sold here in the United States. I believe one of the startups that we profiled recently was cleared to sell a chicken nugget in Singapore. But again, the supporters of this technology say this, we have to produce more food, and this could be part of the puzzle. And yes, as you said, Patty, I got to taste all of these things, as did Melanie, but I was the one who was doing it on camera, which was like a little bit awkward, as I learned. And the salmon, it tasted just like salmon. It is a salmon. The meat was a little bit different. I had a chicken nugget that was grown in a lab, and that, if you blindfolded me, I would have never been able to tell the difference between a chicken nugget, a regular chicken nugget, and the engineered chicken nugget. Partially because if you think about it, when you make a chicken nugget, you've got the meat kind of mixed in with all sorts of different ingredients. It's breaded and fried. There's a lot going on there. But one of the startups that we profiled, what they were trying to do is mimic an actual cut of meat. And again, it's super fascinating. I had no idea. It turns out it's extremely difficult to engineer all the sinew and cartilage and everything else that goes into that piece of meat that you're eating. So I have to say, they were so excited to have me taste it, and I tasted it, and it definitely tasted like chicken. It was supposed to be like a piece of chicken breast, but it was really kind of mushy. Like the mouthfeel was not correct, And so as a journalist, I had to sit there thinking, I don't want to have a reaction here that's inappropriate. I mean, it tasted good, but you know, we reported in our story, okay, it was a little bit soft, the texture wasn't quite right. But you know, that company, they've been plowing ahead. They have plans to open a massive pilot facility in California, still years away from this actually being on the market here in the United States. And both technologies, I should say, very controversial, and that's another reason why some of this has been sort of slow to get to market.
I was just about to jump in and say that too. Like, we knew nothing about GE salmon before we started, or cell-based meat, or the work that the WFP is doing, and particularly with the salmon and the meat. Like, it's so controversial, and there's so many people with different opinions, and we just as journalists have to kind of filter through all the information, rely on experts, and also transparently tell the people we're speaking with that, you know, the proponents for the salmon, like the company, that they know we're talking to legislators that are trying to block it in the system, you know, and advocates that are worried about, you know, genetically modifying fish and they think that's wrong, and climate scientists who actually think this should be happening because they think the way fish farming happens right now is horrible. So there's a slew of opinions on both sides of, you know, each of these topics and stories. But again, we really wanted to try to highlight some solutions, whether or not they're the right ones, in highlighting the problems as well. But the technology is fascinating.
Yeah, I think both of you are much stronger at probably than I would be holding my tongue on having a reaction, because I think I'd say, can I have some ketchup for this? Maybe that'll make it a little easier. Thanks for sharing that, Megan, and what that tasted like, and Melanie for your reporting as well. I want to switch over to politics, because that seems to be another point of intersection for food. So if you'll bear with me here, some of our reporting students here at TCU actually worked on this 4-part series, and they called it Hunger in America. And they did in-depth reporting on what hunger looks like, particularly here in Tarrant County. And one of the issues that they looked at was politics and policy impacting the global food crisis. And so they pointed out this quote from Democratic Congressman Jim McGovern of Massachusetts. He says hunger is a political condition. Quote, "Too many people think that America's hunger crisis is the result of some kind of scarcity of lack of food," which we've mentioned. But nothing could be further from the truth. The truth is that we have the food, the ability, and the means to end hunger in America. What we lack is the political will and moral courage to act. Paul, perhaps you can shed a little bit of light on that. I mean, you're involved in conversations every day about dealing with policy and how we can solve this food crisis.
Thank you. Well, I think, you know, when you're talking about food access, which is the primary issue, can you afford food, and can you afford nutritious food? Remember, in some communities, there's virtual deserts of food, meaning you can buy junk food, but you can't buy fresh, affordable, nutritious food. So we have the issue of access to food, access to the right food, and that includes our own choices of what we make. And those are fundamentally economic questions, and economic questions go through the realm of policy and politics, and there's different opinions about what leads to prosperity for a broad-based, strong middle class, and that's what everyone wants. And what I can say is McGovern had that quote, but he also joined with Republican Bob Dole, and they have the McGovern-Dole program, which is, you know, one of the landmark pieces of legislation that feeds people. So I've seen that in Washington, one of the few things that's still bipartisan is really a focus on food, and that whether that's food aid abroad or helping Julie and her team make sure that people in your community have food. And I think the bigger questions of sustainability and ensuring sort of to teach the person to fish instead of just handing out food. No one wants to hand out food. When we have to hand out food, it's a failure of markets, it's a failure of many different things. And we want people to be able to provide for themselves. That's the ideal. And so the way that we do food assistance has to be done in a way that encourages, agricultural value chains and commercial markets to provide that food, nutritious food that's accessible. And there's many opinions on how to get there, I don't have one opinion on it. I've seen many different models, and what matters is really the outcome. Can people afford food without spending half their income on food, and is it nutritious food? And those are things that I think you do need to look at through the policy lens. And people will debate. And, you know, in our country, we have 50 states, we have many counties, and many of these programs are run through state mechanisms. So the federal government gives a block grant to states and to counties. And so we have a lot of laboratories to test different policies and refine them and see what works. So I encourage that we really look at the evidence. Don't make it a political football that we're kicking back and forth, but look at the evidence and see what works. And what works I live in New York right now. What works in New York might be different than what works in Montana or other communities. It's going to be different approaches, but as long as we focus on food and we're debating that, I think that's a good thing, because no one should go hungry. We have enough food for everybody.
Thank you, Paul. Julie, you mentioned a little bit of that access to food, and particularly having access to healthy food. When Paul mentioned, you know, having food deserts or food insecure communities, can you tell us a little bit about what Tarrant County looks like in that aspect, and maybe how, you know, our political leaders here are working to try to fix that?
Yeah, and I think it is very different depending on where you reside. And obviously, America, the United States, is more advanced in terms of having access to food than many other countries in the world. So it's interesting to hear Paul's perspective on it. But right here in Tarrant County, we have the highest morbidity and mortality rate in 76104, which is just on the east side of I-35, and it is a food desert. To gain food access there, you have to actually take public transportation or have to have a car in order to get to a grocery store. You can shop at a convenience store, but we all know what is provided in a convenience store. Not only is it about twice as much money to buy the same product in a convenience store as a grocery store, it's also highly non-nutritious, right? Potato chips and that kind of thing. And so we're working very hard with urban housing and with local government to stand up a community center in 76104 to try to address that. And we are doing things like teaching a man to fish. So we will have a community garden there, so people will learn not only how to grow the food, but how to prepare it. I was really surprised during COVID, the number of people who would stop me in those big, massive distributions and not know what it was they were receiving or what to do with it. You know, never had seen a beet before, so therefore did not know how. Do I eat this like an apple? Do I bite into it? You know, forget about knowing how to prepare it. So folks who had never seen some of the products that we were distributing to them, and one thing that stands out in my mind is when I first started at the food bank. Somebody gave me this visual. You know, if you talk to your grandparents about what somebody who was food insecure looked like, somebody in the Great Depression, they were hungry, you know, what conjures in your mind? And it's somebody who was emaciated and very poorly nourished, malnourished, right? And we see that in third world countries when we're watching the news hour. You know, we see these folks. Today in our country, if you say, who is food insecure and what do they look like, what comes to mind? Obesity. And that's because of the food desert. So the food that is accessible is bad food, the dollar meal, the value meal, right, that is not nutritious. Now, what does that do? Well, I'll tell you, it puts a huge strain on our healthcare system. Our healthcare system is 19% of this country's gross domestic product. And the 5 chronic disease states that drive up those costs are directly attributed to poor nutrition. So if you have cancer, or if you have heart disease, or if you are obese, or if you have high blood pressure, directly related to what you're putting into your body. And so there's this cyclical effect that happens. There's no reason for it to happen. We just have to figure out the right systems to break the cycle that we've created.
We talked a little bit earlier about about food waste. Americans waste up to 40% of the food that they produce. So Melanie and Megan, you found some interesting solutions to addressing food waste and how to address that issue through your reporting. Can you shed some light on that?
One of the stories that the series focused was on a law in France where, and actually I would be interested to know your take on this, where they basically required supermarkets with an excess amount of food that was about to go bad to donate a certain percentage of it. And the law was kind of controversial because there was no mechanism in place for enforcement, so there were really big fines in place, or technical fines that were supposed to happen, but no one actually checking to make sure that they were following the law, for example. I think in that report it said that the food waste coming from supermarkets and those kind of establishments was like 14% of the food waste overall, but the law didn't address consumer food waste, it didn't address larger areas that were generating food waste. So it was a proposed solution and really tried to start getting at the heart of food waste, but some critics said that it didn't do enough and it didn't go far enough. I'm curious to know about your partnerships in terms of the government contributions you get. Like how much of that is mandated versus how much of that is just goodwill?
Yeah, it's a commodity surplus, so it's what they would not be able to sell otherwise. And what we get from our local donors, it's an incentive type of program, because if you're a manufacturer or distributor and you have excess food and your choice is to throw it away, which costs money, even when they bring it to the food bank, sometimes I get upset that they're bringing me food that definitely is not food I can give to somebody to eat, that I have to throw it away, and now it's costing me money instead of the donor having to pay that bill. But they're incented through the tax system. So if they donate, that's a tax write-off, and that's money for them. And we do that in a number of different ways. Directly to the food bank, we also have store donations that are direct to our partner agencies. So we have over 450 agencies in the community that are located in communities where people live, so the food is more accessible. So schools, colleges, universities, churches, Boys and Girls Club, just a whole gamut of different partner agencies. And they can actually, we re-grant some of our donor dollars to buy vehicles and refrigerators and freezers. And then they can take those refrigerated trucks and go to the local Tom Thumb or the local Kroger and pick up product that Kroger or Tom Thumb would be disposing of that's still, well within shelf life and still quality product, and bring it back into their communities. And
that came up in the France reporting, that people were scared that they were just taking advantage of the tax incentives, which came along with the law. But then, like, the correspondent that was in the field, he picked up a piece of broccoli and said, like, I would never eat this. This is something you would actually give to people. And the woman at the food bank said, no, like, that needs to be thrown away immediately, and they threw it away. So that's a fear with the law, too, that people are kind of jipping the system and taking advantage of the
So
tax.
we take great pride in that at Tarrant Area Food Bank. We track it, how much waste do we have, and our waste is less than 2%. It's because we reject, and our donors don't love that. In fact, just a couple of months ago, we changed our nutrition policy where we're no longer taking any kind of soft drink. Soft drink is one of the contributors to the top 5 chronic diseases. And I'll tell you, my development team was so worried about, well, what will the donors do if we tell them we're not taking soda anymore? Will they quit giving us the good protein too? And it's gone off without a hitch. So you just have to make the decision that I'm going to make a stand on this. And we're fortunate here because I think Dallas-Fort Worth is the 5th largest metropolitan area for food industry. So we're really food rich, if you will, which is shocking that we still have 540,000 people who are hungry. But we have lots of food distributors and manufacturers here. And so maybe I'm in a better position to advocate on behalf of other food banks that are in communities where they don't have as much food industry. But I think you just have to decide, hey, I could have an impact. We could help have an impact on healthcare. We could have an impact on access, and I'm just not gonna do it.
Another thing that came up in the reporting that Megan and I did was this issue of labeling. So date labels. The woman that we spoke with said that there's not much scientific evidence behind the reasons behind why date labels exist. That, she said back in the day, either in the 50s or the 60s, there would be the smell test, right? Like if the milk still smelled good or the yogurt still smelled good, if it didn't smell off, you'd eat it, or the cheese. And that today people are much more reliant on these dates that really don't have much bearing. They aren't properly regulated, and it's up to the manufacturers themselves to put the best, if eaten by, freshest date. I don't know how you guys deal with labeling or what you feel about it, but that came up in our reporting as one potential solution to be able to regulate those dates better and not waste as much food because it's being thrown away by the state where it's actually still good to consume.
There was a movement, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago to come up with a universal date marking system that would be global in nature. And several of the big manufacturing companies signed on that by XYZ date, we will move to a standardized system, because it is not standardized across the globe. There is some standardization in the United States because we're more heavily regulated in this country than many other countries. And in fact, Canada and Latin America often take the food regulation that we set in this country and adopt it for their own. We're kind of the leader in that regard, but there is no global universal date marking system. And I know it's something that has been advocated for, and there's a movement to try to put that down.
I'm interested how each of you look at food in your own homes and daily lives through your reporting, through your work with WFP, Paul, and then through Tarrant Area Food Bank. What is that? Do you look at food differently, and how you approach it for your own homes? Megan, I'll start with you, and then we can kind of move around.
Sure. Yeah. I feel like, for better or for worse, after doing all this reporting on food, my trips to the grocery store have gotten a lot more stressful. You know, you're thinking about not only what you're feeding yourself. I have 2 young sons, what I'm feeding them, and making sure that you're doing the best you can do there. But now you're also aware of all the different issues sort of behind the food on those shelves, right? So, you know, I was aware of a lot of these before, but being immersed in it the way that, you know, we were for the series, it just really brings it kind of more front and center. So, you know, you just kind of do the best you can. And, you know, unfortunately, when you often walk into an American grocery store, you don't have the best choices. You know, I try to buy organic when I can, but I also know that if I'm going to buy some meat, I don't know that that was produced in a humane way. I'm not sure about the environmental effects of that, but that's kind of where I have to buy, that's what I have to buy. The other thing, speaking of food waste, that was something that I didn't think a lot about, but I definitely think a lot about more. One thing that's a little frustrating is we learned through our reporting that household, individual consumer food waste actually is only a small contributor to the whole number. And a lot of the food waste comes more from restaurants and places like that. I don't want to go into too much of a tangent here, but another thing that I found sort of fascinating and also frustrating is that how culture plays a role in the amount of food that we waste, right? We as Americans, we are used to walking into a grocery store and just seeing overflowing, you know, produce aisles, and we're used to walking into that hotel buffet and just seeing piles and piles of food, and we have these massive plates of food that we get at restaurants, and we can't possibly be expected to finish that, and that's why so much food gets wasted, but that's what we've come to expect. And so that's a real challenge in trying to figure out that solution is how do you change the culture?
Thanks, Megan. Paul?
Yeah, I think I was abroad for 12 years, and I just came back a year and a half ago to the United States, and I do look at food a bit differently. I have a family now, and what I notice here, I'm reminded that food is almost like entertainment now. We love food shows, and we love extravagant restaurants. We celebrate those. It's almost entertainment if you can take a trip and go to a restaurant. And that's okay. That's not a bad thing. I think it could be a gateway for us to re-explore, you know, simple local things that are also nutritious. So one of the things I've come to appreciate is we don't eat, I mean, I like meat. I understand it's eating a lot of meat is not good for my health, nor is it sustainable for the planet. It doesn't mean I'm not going to eat meat, but when I lived abroad, I think I came to understand that you can have smaller amounts and really enjoy it, and you can increase things like lentils and beans and grains, whole grains. There's so many wonderful things to eat that are simpler and are also nutritious, and hopefully will lead to better health outcome for me, which I need because I've had high cholesterol in the past. So I think that discovering your grandparents' food, what did they eat? They didn't eat so much meat. Meat was a treat on a special day, maybe once a week. The famous Sunday roast, and that was Sunday, and the rest of the week they ate more simply. So I think that we don't have to all go one direction. We could moderate things, and we could use this interest in food, which sometimes is a bit extravagant, but it could also help us rediscover, gardening in our own backyard, or the wonderful taste of a fresh vegetable that you got locally, and also just those simple meals. If you go back to your food traditions of your family, whether it's Native American or Italian or wherever your family might be from, you'll probably discover some things that are healthy and nutritious and actually very affordable. So that can be something that I hope we could steer some of these foodie conversations towards, and I've personally become interested in too.
Thanks, Paul. Julie?
Well, I'm a dietitian, so I think that I have tried every kind of type of diet, whether it's vegetarian or vegan or whole food or high protein imaginable, just out of curiosity, because I'm obviously interested in nutrition and interested in the field. I agree with what Paul is saying about getting back to the basics and just good, flavorful food in small quantities, and how satisfying and fulfilling that is. And so I today practice a whole food diet where I'm just really trying to look at what's local, what's fresh, and I don't need a lot of it. And I don't want it to be overly processed, and I want a tomato to be red and tasty and not green and hard. And so how do I get those foods? And then I'll just tell another little anecdotal story, because they were talking about living overseas, and I lived overseas in Germany early in my adulthood, and I had a 3-aisle grocery store that I shopped at, and I remember when I came back to the United States, the first time I had to go to the grocery store here, how overwhelmed I felt, because instead of having one type of, name it, milk or carton of eggs, I now had 20 to choose from, and just being overwhelmed with the amount of choice and decision making that takes place. I think about that often, because I don't know why our food system has evolved in that way, because that's certainly not necessary, and it is at the expense and detriment of others who don't have that access, and to our environment.
It's so interesting. I mean, right now I'm actually living abroad in Colombia, and I'm coming back and forth between Colombia and the United States. And that moment you had, like, my husband and I were here for the holidays, and we walked into, I won't say what retailer it was, but a large chain food store, and we were just like, oh, America, like, this is insane. Like, and the products that they're pushing on you, and that it's bad for your physical health, that it's bad for your mental health. I've done a lot of research on that too, between the connection between food and mental health. And it's what I said before, food is connected to everything. And I think that I really learned that from this series. I also think it's easy to know in your mind that you want to be more conscious as a consumer, you want to waste less, you want to eat better, but it's kind of like decisions you have to make every day, and sometimes you kind of slip and you don't do as well 1 month or 2 months, and you can kind of try at it again. It's not going to be like a linear journey, at least not for me. I think the other thing is, I remember when Megan and I were doing the genetically modified salmon story. Megan, do you remember you texted me a photo and it said like non-GM tuna? And for us, like, that would have meant nothing to me before we started our reporting. But by then, Megan and I knew that the salmon was the only type of genetically modified fish or animal that was approved for human consumption, and it wasn't even on the market yet. So much of it is just about marketing and trying to, like, play to consumers' fears or play to consumers' assumptions about what genetic modification is. And I think that was like a moment for me too, that if we can empower yourself as a consumer to just learn a little and a little more and a little more, like we couldn't fall for that trick then, because we knew, you know, there is no non-genetically modified or genetically modified tumor. That was all just a marketing scam essentially to get you to buy that fish. So I think that I've thought a lot about that too. It's really important.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience here in just a second. My last question for you, and you can just make it very simple if you like. Are you hopeful that we can slow down this global food crisis, whether it's here at home or abroad? Are you hopeful? Megan?
Oh, that's a big question. I would say I'm moderately hopeful. I mean, I feel like at some point there's going to be a moment where I'm just kind of, honestly, there's so many parallels between the conversation and the climate change conversation where, you know, there's going to be a point where we realize that, I mean, I hope there comes a point where we realize we just can't keep doing what we're doing. I don't know when that time will come, probably sooner rather than later. I feel like we're sort of getting there with climate change. So, you know, we are an innovative species, and I do hope that, you know, we'll be able to come up with solutions before it's too late.
Thanks, Megan. Paul?
I actually am hopeful, which is strange because I'm concerned about what Julie's seeing locally. We have the same here in New York. 23% of New Yorkers are on food assistance. I'm seeing terrible things abroad. I work in the UN right now, and you're seeing like a Cold War dynamic. I haven't seen that, you know, since I haven't seen it in my professional lifetime, that we're going back to those very, very tough situations in the Security Council and the UN General Assembly. And so I'm concerned, like I've never been before, but I'm still hopeful because we have the capacity. You have in your university there and Texas A&M, there's so many amazing things that we can do to solve this. We just have to put our will to it, not even have to put our minds to it. We know what to do. We have to be able to cooperate on these challenges. And cooperate you can do at the local level, the global level, all different levels, but we need to cooperate and work together on all these things, on climate, on COVID, on conflict. And we can have a really hopeful future where we rediscover the value of food and the job creation potential and the nutrition potential, and there's so many upsides. So I'm actually hopeful.
Thank you, Paul. Julie?
It's a really great question. I'm hopeful too. I unfortunately think that so much of this kind of you know, really impressive change occurs as a result of a crisis. You know, we don't wake up to a situation until it just smacks us in the face. But I am hopeful because I think we do have the capability and the wherewithal. But it's interesting, like, excuse me, even with this COVID crisis, how quickly we revert to the past. And so, you know, we had a lot of attention and a lot of focus on food insecurity during COVID and during the crisis, and that problem has not gone away. It's still there, and yet we're just settling back into the way that it was, you know. And so that's the piece that always gives me pause is, you know, why does it take such a monumental crisis for people to wake up and say we have to do something about this?
Thank you, Julie. Melanie?
I mean, I see people like Julie and Paul doing the work they do, and I'm astounded in a good way that they're able to remain hopeful after day after day after day, kind of seeing the challenges that you guys face, and that you still see. So that makes me hopeful that there are people with the capacity to do the job and the willingness to do that kind of work. To your point about what you just said about when there's a conflict, people want to bring about the change, but then their mind moves to something else. I think that's people like Megan and myself, our jobs. I tend to try to look to the left of the headlines or try to cover things when it's not in super crisis mode necessarily, or when it's not on top of people's minds, because just what you said, this series was long, and I hope that we can continue to report on these kinds of topics, even when it's not trendy or fashionable or or there isn't a crisis mode, because I think the change needs to be sustained, and it's going to be long haul. I don't think it's going to be anything that's going to happen immediately, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thank you for your responses. I'll open it up to questions from the audience. If anybody has a question that they'd like to ask anybody in particular, if you'll just tell us who you are before you ask your question. Yep.
I'm Michael Gustin. Last year I took environmental science and all that, and they were saying that we're predicted to have another 2 billion people come to Earth by 2100, which is about 78 years from now. Due to us already having struggles feeding everybody right now, even though we have the resources to do it, with the extra 2 billion people, what would be a big game plan to go towards that? Will we have the space, the food, and the economy to help out with the extra 2 billion people, or will we be able to handle it at all?
Would anybody like to take a stab at that?
Well,
Go, Paul.
I think, Michael, you're asking a good question. And I think we probably can, but there's a couple of things I would look at. What Megan mentioned is sustainability. We have to think about sustainability from a couple of angles. One is carbon emissions. One is agricultural waste. So if you talk to fisher people versus farmers, the farm waste is ruining the oysters in the bays and things like that. We have to get that balance right. So we have to think about the environmental impact of food from the water perspective and the pollution perspective and the carbon perspective. We have to think about how we eat. There's some good studies out there. There's a study from Johns Hopkins that was pretty recent. It was talking about the carbon cost of nutrition for a growing planet. And protein, animal protein is a pretty efficient way to get protein. You can do it other ways. There's entire civilizations which have done so, like in India, where they get protein from non-animal sources, but it's hard. And what that study says is there's going to be a carbon cost of feeding more people, and so find ways to have animal protein in less carbon ways. Maybe some of Megan and Melanie's reporting point some of those ways. So I think we have to look at sustainability, and then just more efficient agriculture to use the water we have. I mean, our water tables out west, they're not going to sustain the level of food, if we keep using the same amount of water. We have to find a way to more efficiently use water. That's a key part. But I think we can. I mean, I think we can. We have to just really get smart about it and think about the whole value chain, the whole ecosystem of food, and also think about how we eat, and maybe eat less meat, or eat protein sources that are more sustainable, or just less. Find like a sustainable way of eating. I don't think it requires a radical change, but some change for sure. And then just thinking about like a food systems approach to doing that.
Thank you, Paul. Anybody else want to take a stab at that? Okay, thank you. Question over here.
Hey, I'm Connor Cash. I'm in Dr. Onyebades' capstone class, and you came to talk to us earlier, and I'm just sitting here like trying to soak in all this information because I'm kind of new to this. I was part of Jean Marie Brown's reporting class where we talked about food hunger, and we analyzed like the local area and about food deserts particularly. It's kind of interesting hearing you guys talk about the culture and how Melanie, you went from Cambodia to here or Colombia, I'm sorry, but and you were like, wow, America, like the grocery store and everything. And then you mentioned about like the 3-lane like grocery store out in Europe, and I've been to like a bodega before out in France, and it's sort of like a smaller way to shop, and it's easier because you have selective options. So how would you be able to combat food deserts with smaller like bodegas, like kind of, and not necessarily bring in the main like Kroger or like Publix like to the environment? Like I feel like it'd be easier to like bring in like a bodega or something that comes with the convenience store, because it's hard to get to a major major grocery store. So what are some solutions to kind of combat the food deserts without like bringing in the major players?
So we're getting ready to embark on a special project with Stop 6 neighborhood, and it's the first time the food bank has done this. The problem with bringing in any kind of retailer into a food desert is the people who live in a food desert are without means to pay for food. And so the profitability is a limiter in bringing and attracting retailers into those neighborhoods. So our plan is to work with a local retailer who's going to help us with this idea. We're going to have a mobile market. It will be very small scale, but it will offer everything that a grocery store, not instead of having 20 options, you might just have one. And it will be a pay what you can retail market. And so folks can use EBT, which is your SNAP benefit. It's a lower price point, and a debit and credit card will be accepted, no cash. And the idea is that this mobile retail bus will go to a local grocery store, and the food that they would normally be donating to Tarrant Area Food Bank would go onto this bus, and then it goes to the high need zip code, in this case Stop 6, and people can, it's a pretty big trailer, they can walk in and they get to choose what they want. There's a grocery bag, and at the end of that there's a little laptop, and they can pay with credit, debit, or EBT card. And the price is lower, and it's something that we've seen modeled in Louisville, Kentucky. We've seen it modeled in Phoenix, Arizona, and so we're going to model it here. But that's the main issue with food deserts and attracting retailers to come in. The margins aren't there, and the food industry, food margin is less than 5% anyway, so it's a low margin business. And when you couple that with a community that doesn't have the means, and maybe there's theft and a lot of armed robbery and that type of thing, it really detracts the retailers from coming in. And so this is a way that we're going to try to spark the change. And as I mentioned earlier, the urban development nonprofit organization here is putting in multi-use living. So there'll be living apartments and condos, and then down below there'll be other types of community center. CBS is going to put a job training program in to train pharmacy techs, and there'll be a pharmacy in the neighborhood. And it's a way to revitalize that community and hopefully draw a more mixed neighborhood rather than just everybody who's there is low income. That's one example, and I think there's that, and I mean I guess that's why you have hope, because I think there's a lot of people who are trying to experiment with what can we do to try to improve this food system. How can we improve it?
Thank you. Yep, right here. My name is Frances. I'm here with a couple of classes. But how do you justify to that community the long-term value and just why they should take something like Stop 6 and make efforts to eat healthier and get more affordable, healthier food over the dollar value meal?
I think you incent. So you take the example of the housing. There was low-income housing in that neighborhood that had been there since the 1940s and 1950s. So you can imagine the state of the facilities that they were living in, and people were living in that condition. And so they incented by saying, we are going to relocate you, and we're going to pay for your rent while you're relocated to another community. And you will have first right of refusal here in the new property. Brand new condominiums, there's a community resource center that's being planned there. And so it's incentivizing them to want to stay in the community. And the same thing with the groceries. I mean, if it's accessible and the price point is comparable and I can afford it, then more than likely I'm going to make the better choice. But right now I don't even have that choice. All I have access to is the junk food and the high cost, and so I don't really have a choice. And a lot of that's education, I think, too. We spend a lot of time explaining and educating on the value of better nutrition.
That struck me when she said that some people had never seen a beet before. and you had to really explain to people, this is how you could cook it, this is how you could eat it, like, why don't you give it a try, you might really like it. I imagine a lot of it is just like, if you don't even know that that's an option, it's almost like retraining your brain and your habits and re-experiencing things.
Yeah, I walked into this job thinking, okay, we have nutrition educators, thinking nutrition. I'm going to talk to you about carbohydrates and protein and fat and calories. No, it's really food education. It's shocking. You're a kid that has been brought up in poverty and low income. You don't know what fresh produce looks like, and that was shocking to me. How do you not know what a beet looks like, or a zucchini, or a squash? So it was just a bias that I had because I had not lived in that type of environment, and it's real. And it's not because you know, sometimes it is, but it's not mostly because you're somebody who comes from a different country where maybe that country doesn't have that produce. You are born and raised right here, and you have never seen a beet.
Thank you. Right here.
Yes, my name's Bernadette Davila, and I'm actually work in the diagnostic healthcare space. So this topic is super, very, I guess, emotional to myself, and I want to thank TCU for putting, educating us on this or exposing this topic, and also sharing your investigative, reporting. I guess my question is, as concerned consumers, how can we help our local community and the Texas Area Food Bank to do our part and to be able to, give back?
Volunteer. I mean, that's probably the single most thing that's needed. We rely on 20,000 people coming through the food bank every year to help us. So advocate, do things like this so that you're better informed.
Paul, did you have something?
Well, I mean, just one thing about, I just wanted to build on the question before, but thank you, Bernadette, for that. I mean, volunteering, that's great. I think if you do it locally, really, we all need that. So that's a great answer. To Francis's question, just the one thing I think that's interesting. I was working in Gaza Strip, and in Gaza Strip, we were providing cash transfers instead of food aid. And so the question was, what were they buying with that cash? And they were buying food that was not really very healthy. They were buying potatoes, white bread, white rice, and lots of oil. And so we thought about how do we, we're giving them the tool to buy what they want. The costs are very high in Gaza Strip. The food costs are very, very high per the incomes. And what we did is we kind of helped them. We interviewed the women we were working with, and one of the things that seemed to work was rediscovering the grandmother's cuisine. And grandmother's cuisine in Arabic culture is very healthy. It's lentils and beans, a little bit of rice, lots of green beans, and lots of salads, tahini, which is a sesame paste, really healthy things. And they had evolved sort of to forget the grandmother's food and just eat that food that we see in food deserts, high carb, high fat, because it's easier and because people had kind of lost that connection to the land and the traditions. And so we started a train the trainer program where we brought women together. They talked about how they can, on a budget, buy food for their family for the entire week. And they had pretty big households. Household average was six to seven people per household. So they had to make their budgets stretch. And instead of introducing sort of our ideas, we let them kind of talk themselves into their own culture, their own history, and rediscover the old ways of cooking. And we ended up making a cookbook that kind of brought those ideas together. And it was a great journey for them because it reinforced their confidence in their own culture and their own history. And it helped them eat healthy meals on a budget. So I think it's that thing that Julie was talking about, the beet. How do you cook a beet? I don't know how to make mustard greens. There's a lot of inexpensive things that we can eat that are healthy, but we forgot how to cook them. So rediscovering that or learning from other cultures how they eat those are things that I think can really work, but it requires both that access to food, but also then education on how to prepare it and to try to make it fun and make it part of, rediscovering your own culture or learning someone else's culture and bringing that to your household.
So I just want to comment on that, Paul, so thank you for bringing that up, because we do that locally here as well, and which is why I say volunteer. Bringing back the grandmother's recipe, we have a program called Cooking Matters, and this is a train-the-trainer type of program, and we do rely on volunteers to help us facilitate this, and this is to say, what are your ethnic preferences? What are you accustomed to in your own home, and how can we help you add the ingredients that we're providing to you from the food bank to make it real? I want to teach you about the food you're going to receive, which is not always exactly the same as the food that you would go out and purchase for yourself, but it is truly a train-the-trainer. Another program that we do is in our mission kitchen, and it is making ready-to-eat meals. So these are meals that go out to our partner agencies, and families can take them home and put them in the microwave. You think about a mother or a father who is single and has 2 or 3 children, working a job or 2, and then going home and trying to figure out what I'm going to do for dinner, and just how laborious that is. And so we try to make it easier for them by producing these ready-to-eat meals, and they are ethnically driven. So if your culture is such, if Hispanic culture, and you know about making Hispanic cuisine, then we want you to come to our mission kitchen and help us produce these ready-to-eat meals so that they are family friendly and family recognizable based on the food preferences and the culture in which you were raised. So we do that locally too, Paul. Very important to do.
That's great. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your questions. And thank you to our panelists as well. This was very eye-opening. I'm going to hand it over now to Uche so he can kind of talk about our 2022 Pulitzer winner. But for now, a quick round of applause.
I cannot but talk about my experience when it comes to food waste. I recall when I came on campus visit for my present job, and the dean here said, "Oh, let's go have pizza." Remember, I was coming from Carbondale, Illinois, 30,000 population, everything in small portions. And then when they rolled out the pizza, I almost asked the dean, "Is this an assignment?" Because it was huge. Then we went for ice cream. That was something else. Is this an artist's impression of ice cream? Because it was also huge. Of course, we didn't finish it. So I know what it means, waste. Okay, back to my assignment.
Yes.
Let's do some Hollywood style kind of thing. And I'm going to hand you this, but don't open it yet. Both of you are going to do it. Right. So every year we ask our students, to send us proposals so that they can go abroad, with our partners, assisting, go abroad and do an independent study. And so this year we received about, about 7 proposals. And they were very unique, and these students wrote things that they could do in all parts of the world. And so with our partners, we chose the winner. It's only one person that gets it. And so the Hollywood angle to it is that you have to open the envelope, somebody reads the name, and then somebody reads the topic.
We need like a drum roll.
Yeah.
And the winner is...
That's what I'm also saying. The winner is, and then you read the
Mr.
topic.
J.D. Pells.
J.D., are you here? Yes. Please stand up again. We didn't hear it. We are still applauding.
The devastating environmental, social, and health impacts of mining gun and gold.
Wow, congratulations.
Congratulations. So see us after this. All right, let's thank Megan, Paul, and Julie. Okay.
Thank you
as well
so
as
much.
Melanie,
Thank you for having us.
and everybody else who came to this occasion. wonderful discussions, nice questions. We'll do it again next year.
On a different topic.
On a different topic.
Also, I'll say for the 6 people, you said there were 7 who didn't get the grant, if you're passionate about your story, do it anyway, find another way to fund it, find another way to publish it. Part of journalism and part of careers is kind of like not getting it maybe the first run, but I encourage you to still go after it if it's a story you're really passionate about.
Good advice.
Thanks again.